Welcome to the Shifting Inward podcast, where we explore the mindset blocks that keep entrepreneurs stuck. Your mind is one of the most powerful tools at your disposal. Your thoughts shape your actions, and your actions drive your success. When you shift what's happening internally, everything externally starts to move. Hi, I'm Joe Rizk, and in this episode, we're discussing the communication gap. It's the disconnect between what you think you're saying and what people are actually hearing. So let's get into it. The communication gap is the space between what you think you're communicating and what people are actually receiving. You think you're being clear, you think you explained it well, but the person on the other end, whether it's a client, a potential customer, or maybe a team member, walks away confused, misaligned, or with a completely different understanding than what you intended. And here's the thing, this happens all the time in business. You have a sales conversation and the prospect doesn't understand what you're offering. Or you onboard a client and they have different expectations than what you outlined. Or you delegate a task to a team member and they execute it completely different than what you envisioned. You post marketing content and people don't really get it. Every time this happens, your first thought is usually, why didn't they understand? I thought I was being clear. But here's the truth. If they didn't understand, then you weren't clear enough. The communication gap isn't about them being slow or not paying attention. It's about the disconnect between your perspective and theirs. You're operating with context that they don't have. You're using language that makes sense to you, but maybe not to them. You're assuming they know what you mean when they don't. And the result? Miscommunication, misalignment, frustration on both sides, projects that don't turn out right, clients who feel confused, customers who don't buy because they don't understand what you're selling. Communication isn't about what you say, it's about what they hear. And until you take responsibility for closing that gap, you'll keep running into the same problems. So, what does the communication gap actually look like in your business? Maybe you have a sales conversation with a potential client. You explain the offer. You think you were clear. They say yes. But when you start working together, it becomes obvious they had completely different expectations. They thought the scope included things you never mentioned. They're surprised by timelines, deliverables, or what's actually included. And now you're managing frustration on both sides because the communication wasn't clear as you thought. Maybe you're marketing your services and people just don't get it. You know what you do, you know the value you provide, but when you try to explain it, people look confused. They don't understand who it's for, what problem it solves, or why they should even care. And you're left wondering why your message isn't landing. Here's a big one. You delegate a task to a team member or assistant. You explain what you want, you think you are thorough, but when they deliver the work, it's not even close to what you envisioned. And you're frustrated because you have to redo it or spend even more time explaining it. But the reality is, you didn't communicate it clearly enough in the first place. Or maybe you're in a client conversation and you're using jargon, industry terms, or concepts that make perfect sense to you, but they're nodding along, not wanting to seem confused. And later, when the work begins, it's clear they didn't actually understand what you were talking about, but they didn't want to ask for clarification because they didn't want to look uninformed. And here's the internal piece. You avoid over-explaining because you don't want to seem condescending. You don't want to insult their intelligence, so you keep your communication high level, assuming they'll fill in the gaps. But they can't fill in the gaps they don't know exist, and as a result, there is confusion. There's also the flip side. You use complex language, industry jargon, or technical terms because you want to sound credible. I totally get that. You want them to see that you know what you're talking about. You want to establish your expertise. So you communicate in a way that signals, hey, I'm the professional here. But in doing so, you create distance. They don't understand what you're saying, but they don't want to admit it. So they nod along and the communication gap widens. Or maybe you assume people know what you mean because it's obvious to you. You've been thinking about this offer or this product or this service for months. You know it inside and out, but they're hearing it for the first time, and what feels clear to you may feel abstract to them. Here's what happens over time. The communication gap creates friction. It slows down projects. It creates misalignment. It costs you time, energy, and sometimes money. And it damages trust. Because when people don't understand what you're saying, they start to question whether you know what you're doing. So, what is the root of the communication gap? A lot of it comes from years of accumulated knowledge. Once you know something deeply, it's almost impossible to remember what it was like not to know it. You've been working in your business for months or maybe even years. You've built your offer, you've refined your process, you've lived and breathed this work. So when you try to explain it, you may skip steps, you use shorthand, you assume people understand concepts that are second nature to you but could be foreign to them. And here's the problem. You don't even realize you're doing it. To you, it feels clear, but to them, it's missing context, missing explanation, missing the foundation they need to actually understand what you're saying. There's also this: you're speaking from your perspective, not theirs. You know what your offer does. You know the outcome it creates. And yes, it's important to explain the features, the deliverables, all the bells and whistles of what you're providing. But here's what matters more to them: how those features solve their specific problem. They don't just want to know what you do, they want to know what it means for them. And if you're not connecting the dots between what you're offering and how it actually improves their situation, they won't get it, even if you're being clear on your end. And here's something we can't ignore. Social media and constant scrolling have likely changed how people process information. Attention spans seem shorter. People are accustomed to consuming information in 15-second clips, headline-style summaries, and bite-sized posts. So when you try to have a real conversation, whether it's a sales call, a client meeting, or even an email, they might not be fully present. They're skimming, half listening. Their brain is in consumption mode, not processing mode, and that makes clear communication even harder. You often have to work twice as hard to cut through the noise and actually land your message. Then there's the fear of being condescending. You assume that if you explain too much, you'll insult their intelligence. You'll come across as patronizing or like you're talking down on them. So you keep things high level. You stay abstract. You let them figure it out. But clarity isn't condescending. Confusion is disrespectful. When you leave people guessing, you're not respecting their intelligence, you're wasting their time. And here's the flip side. You want to sound credible. You want them to trust that you know what you're doing. So you lean into jargon. You use technical terms. You communicate in a way that signals your expertise. And in doing so, you create distance. They don't understand, but they don't want to admit it because they think they should, so they nod along, and you assume you've communicated clearly even when you haven't. Here's another issue. You explain something and assume they got it if they didn't interrupt. But silence doesn't mean understanding. People stay quiet for all kinds of reasons. They're embarrassed to admit confusion, they think they should already know, or they don't want to hold things up. Just because they didn't ask a question doesn't mean they understood. And finally, there's speed. You're moving fast. You have a lot on your plate, so you communicate quickly. Fire off an email, give verbal instructions, explain something once and assume it's done. But communication isn't a checkbox. It's a process. And when you rush it, gaps form. But here's the truth. The communication gap is always your responsibility to close, not theirs. If they didn't understand, it's not because they weren't listening, it's because you didn't communicate in a way that worked for them. And as soon as you own that, the better your communication becomes. Okay, so let's reframe this. Communication isn't about what you say, it's about what they understand. If there's a gap, it's your job to close it and not theirs. That might feel like extra work, but it's actually a competitive advantage. The entrepreneurs who communicate clearly will win more clients, retain better relationships, and build stronger teams. So here's the shift. Clarity isn't condescending, it's generous. When you simplify your message, break things down, and make sure people understand, you're not insulting their intelligence, you are respecting their time. You're making it easier for them to say yes, to take action, to work with you. Confusion is what's disrespectful, not clarity. Another shift. Using jargon doesn't make you sound smart, it makes you sound inaccessible. The best communicators aren't the ones who use the most complex language. They're the ones who take complex ideas and make them simple. If you can't break down what you do so a 12-year-old could follow, you're likely confusing your potential customers as well. And here's the truth about over-explaining. You're not going to insult someone by being thorough. You're not going to lose credibility by making sure they understand. In fact, the opposite is true. When you take the time to explain clearly, to check for understanding, and to confirm alignment, people will trust you more because they feel seen, they feel taken care of, and they know you're not assuming that they'll figure it all out. And here's another reframe. Silence doesn't mean understanding. Just because someone didn't ask a question doesn't mean they got it. Stop assuming. Start confirming. Ask, does this make sense? Ask, what did you hear me say? Ask, what questions do you have? Create space for them to admit confusion without feeling foolish. And here's what changes when you own the communication gap. You stop blaming them for not understanding. You stop being frustrated when things don't go as planned. You start taking responsibility for how you communicate, and that shift alone will improve every interaction you have with clients, with customers, and with your team. So stop asking, why didn't they get it? And start asking, how can I communicate this more effectively? Because the gap is yours to close, and when you do, everything gets easier. So here are some tips to help you communicate more effectively. First, speak to their level of understanding, not yours. Before you explain something, ask yourself, what do they already know? What context could they be missing? What assumptions am I making? Then adjust your communication to meet them where they are, not where you are. Second, use examples and analogies. Abstract explanations don't land. Concrete examples do. If you're explaining a process, walk them through a real scenario. If you're describing an outcome, paint a picture of what it looks like. Analogies help people grasp complex concepts by connecting them to something they already understand. Third, simplify your language, but don't strip away your expertise. Yes, cut unnecessary jargon, that kind that just creates confusion or makes you sound like you're trying too hard. But when technical terms are the most accurate way to describe something, use them. Just make sure you explain what they mean. The goal isn't to dumb things down. It's to make your expertise accessible. You can sound credible and be clear at the same time. Define your terms, break down complex concepts, but don't avoid the language of your industry just because you're afraid of sounding too smart. Fourth, confirm understanding. Don't just assume it. After you explain something, ask, does that make sense? Or, what questions do you have? Better yet, you can ask, what's your take on what we just discussed? This invites them to share their understanding in their own words, and you'll immediately know if there's a gap. Fifth, repeat the important stuff. Don't say it once and move on. Key points need repetition. People don't absorb everything the first time, especially if they're distracted, overwhelmed, or processing a lot of information at once. Repeat your main message in different ways throughout the conversation. Sixth, slow down. You don't need to rush through explanations. Give people time to process. Pause after key points. Let silence sit for a moment. Rushed communication creates gaps. Thoughtful communication closes them. Seventh, put it in writing. After a conversation, follow up with a written summary. Email them the key points, outline next steps, confirm what was agreed upon. This gives them something to reference and eliminates the "I thought you said misunderstandings later." And finally, get feedback. Ask people, "Was I clear?" Ask your clients, "Did you understand what to expect?" Ask your team, "Do you know what I'm asking for?" If the same miscommunication keeps happening, that's a signal. Adjust how you communicate until the gaps close. The communication gap doesn't close on its own. You have to be the one to close it by being intentional, by checking for understanding, by prioritizing clarity over sounding impressive. And when you do, you'll see significant improvement across your business, fewer misunderstandings, better alignment, and stronger relationships. If this resonated, drop a comment and share your story. Have you experienced the communication gap in your business? What's helped you communicate more clearly? I'd love to hear about it. And I invite you to join our free school community to connect with other entrepreneurs who are breaking through mindset blocks and supporting and celebrating each other's growth. Link in the description. I'm Joe, and I help entrepreneurs shift inward so they can move forward. See you next time.